I'm going to go ahead and begin by reading a little bit from Chapter 3, and then I'm going to talk about the book afterwards. But I picked Chapter 3. It's after things start actually getting really exciting, and leading up to this part, Effie's moved down to Costa Rica. She's stumbled upon this night market, this fruit market that opens at night and has some really strange people in it. And then she meets this creepy character named Max Lycan, who gives her this warning about the market, which she ignores. And then she goes to a school which isn't very pleasant, and she's trying to get home from school, but she has some difficulties. And so she's offered this ride, but then as she gets into the van, she suddenly realizes that she's being taken home by Max, the creepy man who was giving her the warnings earlier. All right. So as he steps in, Chapter 3 begins. Chapter 3. Effie froze for a split second and thought of nothing and everything. The psychopath has got me. Finally, flight took over. Throwing her bag out of the way, she lurched for the sliding door, only to find it had no inner handle. Safety first, Max chuckled and put the van in gear. In complete desperation, Effie swung her fist to the back of his neck. Faster than she could follow with her eyes, his paw snatched her hand out of the air. She stood, panting heavily, staring into his yellow eyes. His long, sickly fingernails grated her skin as he held her wrist with intense strength. She struggled again, yanking her arm to pull away, but he, fully turned around in the front seat now, easily caught her other hand and pushed her into the seat behind him. He hardly seemed to notice her struggle to escape his grasp. When she looked back at his face, he seemed merely amused. Knock it off. You're not going to get anywhere by struggling. Anyway, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just your ride home. Let me go. Let me get out of here, you creep. He laughed. I'll let you go, but I wanted to have a little chat first. Now, if you don't mind, we'll chat as we drive. Turning around like this is uncomfortable, so I'm going to let go of you now. Don't do anything stupid, and I'll have you back in your house in about 15 minutes. Effie nodded slowly. He released his hand from her wrists and withdrew them, staring into her eyes the whole time. As soon as his hands were clear, she hurled herself at him, aiming her shoulder for his chin and throat. Her shoulder connected, but she might as well have hit a wall. The van skidded forward for a second as his foot slipped off the brake, throwing Effie between the seats and lashing her face with the seatbelt buckle. Then she felt herself hoisted up and tossed into the back seat. She heard the wrench of the parking brake and then felt the weight of his arm pinning her down. Nice try. Had enough? He growled. Effie panted, tears stinging her eyes. Her shoulder throbbed painfully. Please don't hurt me. Leave me alone. He growled again and withdrew his arm. Sit still and listen. I've got something to say to you. She lay still. He watched her for a moment and then climbed back into the front seat. He popped the emergency brake back off and pulled out of the school lot. I'll have you home in just a few minutes. I just have a warning for you. Effie remained silent. You've been stupid, you know that? You got some good advice and you had to ignore it. Now they know you're sent. Effie shook her head. She had no idea what he was talking about. He was out of his mind. He was going to kill her. I've been tracking them for years. I looked over many countries to find out where they'd gone. It just seemed too convenient for them to disappear. They couldn't have all just died, I said, but no one believed me. So I tracked them. And then I found them all hiding out here. He glanced in his rear view at her. They're not human. They're not even alive. They're monsters. I don't know what you're talking about, Effie said. The night dwellers, the evil ones, the fruit market at night, he said and growled a low growl. I saw you slip down there into their domain. You even walked with one of them. You touched his hand. He left his smell on you. Max sniffed and ran his hand over his mustache and beard. Now you smell like the dead. That acrid smell of copper and death. He shook his head and continued. They know you now. They'll look for you. They're hungry. They're hunting. Now you must never go back. Stay locked up at night. Stay away from them. He was silent for a while. Then, you'll stay away? Effie breathed slowly. She should just comply. She read somewhere that if you comply, you're less likely to be hurt. Don't make him angry. I'll stay away. You'll stay locked up after dark? You'll not go out? Okay, I won't. He growled as if he didn't believe her. What did you and him talk about? What did that night dweller say to you? I don't know. I don't remember. He just said he just wanted to protect me. He just walked me to the bus. Max growled again. Protect you. He spat. He grumbled to himself for a moment. They pulled up to Effie's house. Max put the van in neutral and pulled the emergency brake. He walked around and opened the door. Effie stood slowly and picked up her bag. She eased out of the van and backed away from Max. I told you I'd bring you home. Now don't forget, I'll be watching. He climbed back into the van and rolled down the window. Oh, and Effie, you may want to ice that shoulder. It's going to hurt in the morning. He laughed and pulled off. Effie managed to get her key to the lock and enter, closed the outer door, stumbled to her room, and collapsed on her bed. She shook and sobbed until her stomach clenched. All right, I'm going to stop there for now. If you want to see what happens, you can take back up. So I want to talk to you a little bit about writing a book and how much fun I had doing it. I first started the idea. It's a cheesy teen novel. And I first started the idea when Twilight was really popular, and I said, hey, I could totally write this. It's very hard. The idea that vampires, got really popular for a while. And I like stories about heroes and stories about facing your fears and facing evils and trying to overcome your problems. And so at first I played around with it and wrote something of a parody of Twilight with the vampire character who's all alluring and cool, and the werewolf guy there in the background, and the girl who's sort of caught in between and all romantic and everything. But after I began that and was playing around with it, I began to realize that I kind of liked the characters more than I thought I would, and I got more into telling the story than I thought I would, and it started going places that I didn't expect. And I think that sort of was the fun of writing a book, is that it was very much like reading a book. I wrote it in a month as part of National Novel Writing Month, which I've tried to encourage a lot of my students to do, and some have done very successfully. And so I wrote it very quickly, and in writing it quickly, I had to sort of explore how to tell a story very rapidly and what was going to happen next. I had a general idea of where I wanted it to go, and I think that's how we mostly are with books. We get a book and we read the first page, and we have a general idea of where it's going to go, what the characters might turn into and what they might become. But we sort of have to watch the journey and see how it goes. And I had a similar experience writing it because I knew generally where it was going to go, but I had to sort of watch the journey. I found that there was a couple of things I liked to do to try to write the story and to try to make it interesting and worthwhile to my audience. I didn't want a story that would be boring or have too many huge plot holes. Two things I don't like about bad story writing. One, bad dialogue, and two, unmotivated action. And you can always, I choose my television shows based upon good dialogue and well-motivated action, unless I'm just really dearly in love with the show and start veering towards the bad side like Doctor Who. Last season was not so good. But otherwise, 50 years of history, you got to give it some credit. That's why I like shows like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which is written by Joss Whedon. If you've seen that, highly recommend it. If you haven't, it's got great things in it like really spot-on dialogue, some of the best dialogue I've ever seen. And the characters are highly motivated. They have reasons for everything they do. So in order to sort of accomplish something like this, being a very amateur writer and just playing around, since I was doing this mostly for fun, each time something would happen in the book, I would have to sit back and ask myself, why does this happen? And how would this character respond to this action? So sometimes the book started going directions I didn't expect, simply because as I asked myself, what would the character do in this situation, I realized that the character had to make some choices that I hadn't previously expected. There were certain things that had to happen because of the plot, but then how are the characters going to realistically respond to them? How are they going to respond in proper motivation? And what are they going to say? They need to sound real and act real. This is something called verisimilitude. It's really important. If a story doesn't feel real, then we get distracted from it. We feel distance from it. Another television show, which completely fails at this test, is Once Upon a Time. Now, I know some of you like the show, and I'm sorry, but the very first episode, we open with Snow White and Prince Charming getting married. And here they are standing at the altar. They're about to say their vows, and in walks the evil queen. Okay, perfect fairy tale story. We all have certain expectations that are set up, right? We know where this is going generally, and the queen has a curse for them. The first thing that happens as the queen waltzes in, she's all evil, ooh, scary, clouds billowing. Snow White grabs the prince's sword, and she holds it out, like she's going to, attack. And the prince, being very cool and very, suave, pushes the sword down and says, let's not stoop to her level. Because, of course, he doesn't want to be evil like her. And so then the queen utters her curse, turns around, and begins to walk out. As she walks out with her back turned, the prince takes his sword and throws it at her back. Not at all stooping to her level, of course. Okay, so that kind of unmotivated action, where we've established something about a character and then we immediately deny it, is a failure. I don't want my characters to come off like that. I want them to feel real. I want them to feel authentic. And so I tried to use as many details from life as I could. Granted, my hero is female, and that's going to be a little bit of complexity because I'm not, so I have to sort of try to put my mind in that situation and say, okay, what would a girl do in this situation? All right, that's not the easiest thing in the world for me to do, but I had two sisters who taught me well, and my wife taught me all the terminology about feminine clothing. I had a student who praised the fact that I used camisole in the book because, I don't really entirely know what a camisole is, but I've heard the term before and I tried to use it correctly. So anyway, trying to understand certain things about the character, what the character would think, what the character would do, trying to get in the mind of the character, led to all kinds of interesting places. For instance, for a while, I had certain things that had to happen to the character. And as they happened to her, I realized that her father, who is a fairly aloof character, he's distant from her, and he doesn't interact with her a whole lot, I realized that in spite of his aloofness, he should be noticing some of the things that are happening. And so then I had to stop and think, okay, why isn't he noticing? Why isn't he around to respond to this girl who's obviously undergoing some serious drama? Surely he would notice. And then suddenly I realized he's not there. Why isn't he there? And it took me a little while to figure out he's not there because something must have happened to him. There's no other way that this story can go forward. And so, where is he? And so, along with Effie, my heroine, I had to figure out what happened to him. It turns out that he's been kidnapped and taken somewhere. And you'll have to figure out where and why along with the book. But I realized that certain things are going to happen. Other times, it made sense for her to walk up and knock on a door, but I didn't really entirely know who was on the other side of that door until I rode up to that moment and said, somebody's got to be on the other side of the door. Who is it? Who makes sense? And so when the door opened, sometimes I was as surprised as someone reading the book because suddenly, there's this character. Because the character made sense in that moment. All right, so motivated action, making sure that as I went through, I was constantly asking questions. What would my character do next? Now that this has happened, how would a real person in this situation react to it? Have any of you ever read Orson Scott Card, like Ender's Game and some of those books? They're starting to become popular now because the movie of Ender's Game is coming out. Orson Scott Card is a really excellent storyteller. He's also very good at writing about storytelling. In fact, in one of his forewords to Speaker for the Dead, which is a sequel to Ender's Game, he writes about the complexity of building characters. And he says one of the biggest complexity of building characters is the fact that you write a character, you write his or her personality, and you tell all about that. But then when you write another character, something happens. And in Speaker for the Dead, he wrote a family that had many, many characters. It was this Catholic community, and so they have lots of children, So there's this family with many, many members. And one of the issues with having a whole lot of members or a whole lot of characters in a story is that not only do you have to write the character, but you have to write the inter-characters, the characters that are between characters. So, for instance, I'm Mr. Nance, and to you, I act a certain way because we have a certain kind of relationship. Our relationship becomes a kind of character, almost. Now, if I were talking to Mr. Newman over here, and I was chatting with Mr. Newman casually in the hall, I'm going to talk to him differently than I'm going to talk to, say, my boss, my superiors, Mr. Spurlock. When I see Mr. Spurlock, I chat with him differently. I chat with him differently than I chat with my wife or my grandmother or any other character. In fact, every combination of two characters creates an inter-character. There's a relationship between the two, and that creates some kind of tension, some kind of, it's almost as if you have to write a whole character in between each character. So the more characters you have in a story, the more complex things get. But that's where storytelling becomes fun. That's why we like shows like, again, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., because you've got the relationship between each character, and a lot of times with a good television show, when you have a good cast of characters, different episodes will focus on the relationship between two characters at a time, or three characters at a time, or sometimes one character versus an already established community. So that kind of interaction creates its own characters, creates its own kind of storytelling. Now, as far as Night Market goes, the story of this vampire story, it started out as, again, like I said, a cheesy vampire story, but the more I wrote it, the more I liked the characters, and the more I liked the ideas that I had. Old stories like Twilight, which were very popular for a while and kind of have faded in popularity, were interested in introducing vampires as something appealing. vampires have always been kind of appealing. They've always been kind of seductive, almost. There's something alluring about a vampire figure who is feeding off of you, but also at the same time tempting you towards something. And what's the temptation of a vampire? Well, if you've been in my class, you've probably read Thomas Foster, and have talked about the idea of vampirism being somebody feeding off of somebody else, but there's something else there. There's a desire by feeding off of somebody else to make yourself stronger, to make yourself greater. And the traditional vampire story, the vampire drinks the blood of someone else to make himself live forever. It's that immortality that's alluring. It's that eternal youth and strength. There's something scary about growing old, about losing your abilities. You may be young and strong right now, but someday all that's going to fade away. And it's not really a great idea to feel like that's going to fade away. I'm already getting older. I find gray hairs in my beard and wrinkles in my eyes. And I see that, and I don't mind so much, but if I were a vain kind of person, I might be more bothered by that. And so there's something vain about vampirism. It's about feeding off of others to make yourself stronger. Now, Twilight tried to circumvent that. They said, okay, we've got the idea of living forever, being really good-looking forever, being awesome forever. Let's just make that a good thing instead of making it a negative thing. But I don't think you can. Because even though in Twilight, where you've got characters who are good at heart, and they eat cheetahs instead of human beings, all right? And they try to make themselves, they try to make themselves pay, this inner turmoil, which is this romantic kind of figure. But really, they get to live forever and drive really nice cars, be filthy rich, and be really hot forever, okay? So what's the downside of that? Well, the downside is that it's hedonistic. It's looking at humanity and saying, I want to be awesome forever. That's a really selfish thing to do. And when you turn into a vampire, even a good one, what you're taking on is a huge cost. The cost is more effectively explored in deeper books like Tuck Everlasting. Eternal youth is not always a good thing. There's a bit of a curse to it. And I think Twilight kind of misses that. So with my vampires, I've tried to accomplish something a little bit different. They've chosen a different path. They want to be good, some of them. And there's, of course, the evil lurking ones that want to eat everything and destroy everything. The devouring bad guy, the looming force of evil. But you've also got the ones that are choosing good. And with choosing good, I think you can't choose immortality and hedonism and be good. And that's going to be that's a significant theme in the first book, but it's even more so as the series continues. Book 2 I'm really excited about. Effie becomes a lot tougher of a character as she's finally learning to overcome some of her problems on her own. She has to do a bit of it by herself without her friends backing her up. And some of the other minor characters become much more developed in the second book. I'm really excited about it. I hope that it, when it's finally done, that you will like it as well. But this idea that there's something good about choosing to let yourself go. Something good about choosing not to be, I'm going to be awesome forever, and so I choose my own awesomeness. That's pretty selfish. But instead, choosing something good, and choosing that there is a goodness in dying, perhaps. Walt Whitman talks about death in his famous poem where he talks about the grass. And if you're familiar with the poem, it's really beautiful. A child picks up a bunch of grass and brings it to the poet or the speaker and says, what is the grass? And he tries to figure it out, and he tries to know how to answer the child, and he thinks of all these metaphors. And he thinks in the end that it's the hair of the graves. And in his final line in that section of the really long poem, Leaves of Grass, he says, to die is different from what we supposed, and luckier. Sometimes maybe there's something to not hanging on to immortality, not hanging on to my own hotness. I mean, it's pretty empty in the long run. But there's something better, maybe. And maybe it requires sacrifice. Maybe there's something more to it. And so that's what I hope to capture in my books, and I hope to explore these kind of themes. I'm very thankful to my awesome family who taught me a lot of cool stuff that helped me to be able to write the books. I started with the idea, I was reading Twilight and vampires who eat cheetahs instead of, and then suddenly that changed their, I don't know. Anyway, then I got to thinking, okay, well, what would be a good substitute for blood that's not blood? And my uncle stumbled across the idea that apparently coconut water was used in blood transfusions in World War II because it has a lot of the same characteristics. So I had to set my characters in a nice, Central American locale with lots of coconuts where they can try to avoid eating blood. But the effects, of course, coconut water is not blood, so it's got different effects. So they don't live forever by drinking this coconut water. It does sustain them for a while, but it's not going to give them immortality. So they've chosen mortality over immortality. I was thankful to my uncle for helping me discover that. Also thankful to my sister, who lived in Costa Rica for a while. I got to visit her a couple of times and get to see what life was like down there and what the environment was like. And I pulled from a lot of that and interviewing her more to try to add to that verisimilitude, that capturing what it's like. And she approved my book, so that made me feel good. I was also really thankful to my students because, again, I started just playing around and having a good time and trying to write a story. And then I decided to do the whole write a novel in a month thing, and I sat down and I cranked it out. But at the same time, it was hard to actually do anything with and feel like I needed to publish it. But my students were all super encouraging and gave me lots of good feedback and advice. So thank you all who helped me to put it together and self-publish it and have fun with it. I guess we're out of time now, but thank you all so much for coming and listening to me talk. And if you have any questions about it, I'd be glad to answer them or anything else. Thank you so much.